All right, back on July 1st, 2024, I wrote a blog post entitled Accept Who You Are. In that article, I was reflecting on basically about 5 years ago. It's October 2024 right now, but about 5 years ago, in March of 2019, so I guess that'd be about 5.5 years ago, I started working as a security guard at a hospital up in Tacoma, Washington. And at the time, I was trying to build a business as a motivational speaker. I had been doing that for probably about 5 years at that point. And then previous to that, I had tried to build a business basically as a personal trainer, working for a local gym up there. And at the time, I got into security work because I knew being former military, it would be an easy job to get. And it would also be a job that I could easily flex around the business that I was building at the time. And, I'd be able to, pay my bills, whatever the case may be. But I've worked, because I was a combat medic in the military, I've worked in hospital scenarios multiple times. Since leaving the military, I worked as an emergency services technician at Tacoma General Hospital. And then while I was in the military, I did a couple of rotations at hospitals in different parts of the country. And then, of course, working as a security guard, I did that for about a year before the pandemic started and before I moved here to Arkansas, where I live now. And at that time, look, y'all, I always say this, and I could be wrong about this, but I bet you I'm right. Like, nobody wakes up and says, or as a little kid, nobody says, man, I want to be a security guard when I grow up. I grew up in the 90s, and when I was growing up, it was all about going to college, getting a really good degree so you get a high paying job as an engineer, lawyer, doctor, whatever. And then that, by doing that, your life was deemed successful. At least that's the message that I got, I feel like, from society as a whole. And, I got an engineering degree and I started working for corporate America, and I absolutely hated it. And I ended up joining the military because I wanted to do something very different. And people thought I was crazy for that back then. But something that I've struggled with, this was in 2006 when I left engineering. So that's 18 years ago. And something that I have struggled with since leaving the military, because I was a Green Beret in the military. I was a U.S. Army Special Forces medic. Again, this is a job that comes with a lot of respect. People find out I'm a combat veteran of the war in Afghanistan. I have never had anybody be like, I have never had anybody scoff at me for being a former Green Beret and a combat vet. But I do remember one time distinctly, a few months after I gotten my security guard job up in Tacoma, I was walking into a local coffee shop that I frequented often before I started working as a security guard. Usually when I went to this coffee shop, I was going there to work on writing, either for content that I was making, podcasting, speaking, whatever I was doing at the time. And so, I'd have on normal clothes. But on this day I walked in, I had my security guard uniform on. And there was a police officer there, sitting there, who also normally frequented that coffee shop. And when he saw me walk in, he laughed at me. It was like being transported back to middle school or something. He laughed at me, and I could tell like he was laughing because he was kind of like, "What are you doing in that ridiculous security guard uniform?" And this is someone, he didn't know my background as a veteran or any of these things. He had just seen me in my civilian clothes, and now I'm in a security guard uniform. Meanwhile, he's a police officer, so he's like, you should be ashamed of yourself walking around like that. Now, the reason I tell that story is because I was already struggling in my mind at the time, because I was focused on the wrong things. I was already struggling with, honestly, I was feeling like a loser at the time, because here I am, I'm working on my second business that is not bringing any money in. I had to quit fitness, even though I love fitness. and I love teaching people fitness, etc. I just could not make it work as a business, probably largely because of my own shortcomings. Same thing at the time with motivational speaking. Very talented public speaker, but I couldn't make it work financially. So I was struggling with a lot of anxiety about the future. I mean, I wasn't in debt, mind you, but I couldn't see a financial future at the time. And then working as a security guard in a hospital setting in particular, something that years earlier, back in like 2014, this was 2019 that I was doing security, but back years prior to that, back in like 2013, 2014, I was working as an emergency services tech at Tacoma General up there, a different hospital at the time. And just from that experience, something that I had learned was, and for those that don't know, an emergency services tech is like a nursing assistant in the ER. You assist the nurses and the doctor with patient care in the emergency room. And something that I noticed in that year and a half that I did that job is that just people didn't have a lot of respect for anyone besides the doctors and the nurses. And I mean, and I get it. Like, the doctors and the nurses are the ones delivering the most, complex patient care. And so I understood that, but it just seemed like if you didn't make a certain amount of money in your role, or your role didn't require a certain level of education, I don't want to say you were looked down upon necessarily. Some people certainly did. Some people certainly had an attitude of, if you weren't nurse or doctor or pharmacist or physician's assistant, something like that, you don't deserve the same respect or attention, etc., as someone else, or you are not as smart, or blah, 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 whatever. And to some extent, I can understand that because, of course, if you're going to be a doctor, I mean, you got to go through a lot of schooling. You got to learn a lot of stuff. You got to be able to do a lot of stuff. You're going to carry a lot of responsibility in that environment. But I remember walking away from that job with a really bad taste in my mouth for healthcare as a whole. And that's primarily because it kind of confirmed something that I already believed was, because when I was in the military and as a special forces medic, I was trained, like highly trained. I mean, I got to deliver a baby while I was going through training. I helped doctors do surgeries in the OR. You're taught a lot in the military in that pipeline. But in my time working in hospitals, and I thought about going to medical school during that time frame, but in my time working in hospitals, I just saw that a lot of the problems that patients had were lifestyle issues, which is what, I had already planned into going into fitness after I left the military, but it confirmed that for me. And then when I was working in fitness, I just realized that a big part of people's problem is just like motivating the self and self-discipline and self-control, which is why I got into speaking, et cetera, et cetera. And so when I left the hospital environment the first time, I just remember thinking, all people care about is money. All people care about is like your title and how much education you have, which fits well with the narrative that I had growing up in the 90s when I finally graduated high school in 2000 and became an engineer. That seemed like what success was. And so fast forward to 2019, I'm working as a security guard, and I'm having experiences like I did with that police officer where he's like laughing at me because I'm a security guard. And I'm working at a hospital, and I'm struggling with my self-worth because I feel like, I'm just a security guard. And of course, nobody grows up wanting to be a security guard. But over the last 5 years in doing security work, one of the things that I've realized and come to appreciate more about it is it does give me the time and opportunity to think about this, writing, making content. I've written a book in the last 5 years, and now I'm starting this podcast and YouTube journey again, probably for like the fourth time that I've started it, and hopefully this time I can sustain it. It's because it's such a low stress job. It gives me the opportunities to pursue these other things that really give meaning and value to my life personally, and I'm still exploring other job options. In the article I write that, I'm starting to get to a point where I'm accepting just being a security guard, and I do, but I still look for other options. I think I'd like to get into the trades, perhaps, but we'll see how that unfolds. But while I'm working security, man, it's a job that's great for someone who has these other aspirations like I do. Someone who enjoys writing, enjoys content creation. It's a good pairing. I mean, while I'm walking around at work, I will think about my ideas. Sometimes I'll even sit down and write out blog posts and write out the first paragraph or two of a blog post that I come up with, or I'll think about ways to edit a video or edit a podcast, et cetera, et cetera. And so being a security guard allows all those things. Also, the other thing I've spent a lot more time thinking about as I got older is the fact that many of the jobs and job roles that come with a lot of respect and come with a lot of prestige in our society, what we have to remember is that there are a lot of other jobs that don't require the same education, don't command the same income, but are still required to make society work. And I think we saw this during COVID. But with the hospital, for instance, yes, the doctors and nurses deliver the patient care primarily, but you still need nursing assistants, maintenance staff, groundskeeping staff, security guards, especially in urban environments. You need all the administrative staff that does patient data input, et cetera, et cetera. You need all these roles that don't require degrees, don't get paid as much, in order to deliver a quality patient experience, and in order for the doctors and nurses to be able to focus on their jobs and do their jobs. And if you can expand that out, obviously, to society as a whole, you need the police officers, you need the people who pick up the garbage, you need lawn care people, you need tradespeople who know how to work on homes, you need the Uber drivers, the taxi drivers, the people who work in grocery stores, you people who work in restaurants. Like, all the amenities that we have in society are built on all these different little roles that, like, I think culturally don't receive the same kind of respect as the more prestigious careers like engineering, lawyer, doctor, etc. And so what am I saying? A big part of what I'm learning to do, just like the article is titled, is I'm just learning to accept who I am. And we will always, even if I were a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer, there would still be people in the world who would find a way to devalue what I do and marginalize what I do. And this is something that I learned growing up. Like, it didn't matter what I did growing up as a kid. People always thought of me as the fat kid. And people always disrespected me because of it. Didn't matter what else I did. Didn't matter how much I worked out. Didn't matter how good of grades that I made in school. People still found a way to bully me and belittle me. And so the older I get, the less I care about those cultural norms. But in saying that, I still struggle with this, and it's taken. I mean, I left engineering in 2006, and now 18 years later, from time to time, especially when things come up where I feel like money would more easily solve the problem. Like, if I had more money, the car would be easier to fix, or we could have a nicer place to live, me and my wife, or maybe my wife wouldn't have to work or worry about making more money herself. Whenever money things come up, I always think about, man, if I were still an engineer. But the problem is engineering made me miserable. And I can't imagine who I would be today from a health standpoint and just from a vibrance standpoint if I spent 18 years doing something that made me utterly miserable. And I still say, strategically, leaving engineering and then joining the military was still strategically the best decision that I've ever made in my life. And I don't regret it for a moment, but I still get caught up in this cultural idea of what success is. And This is where we have to work on our own stories. I talk about it in my book. Let me grab the book real quick for the YouTube folks. But principle number 2 from my book: understand your story. Principle number 2 from this book: adapt and overcome. 3 principles to master the most important skill in life, which is personal ownership. Look, y'all, like when I was making that transformation from engineer to something else that I would rather do, I constantly had to battle that old success narrative of, especially when I first started, I started working as a personal trainer and I wasn't making any money. And in the book, I talk about getting evicted from my apartment for failure to pay rent. At one point I was $60,000 in debt. Like it got bad financially. And I felt like a fool because what I had allowed to be indoctrinated into my mind, the narrative or the story that I had was, a good life is a high paying salary in a prestigious career. But success is a subjective thing. That was the ultimate thing that I learned. And I had to define what success was for me. And I still have to work to define that and focus on that. And so if you're in a normal job out there and you're struggling, just remember, even if you ultimately go and acquire some skills to do a different job that maybe is a more prestigious career. I'm not against anybody doing that. But just remember, it's going to be harder to come up with the ideas, find the resources, and even have self-respect once you get to that place if you can't respect where you are. Like you'll always be chasing more. Because like I said, people, in the article I write, yes, that police officer laughed at me that day. And I just let it roll off my back because I understood what was happening there. But what's interesting is we all know in 2019, very, very soon from that point in 2020, COVID would hit and then you'd have all the protesting and the defund the police. And, now suddenly like nobody wants to be a police officer because of all the hell that police got during the last 5 or 6 years. So I wonder what he went through, especially up there in Washington, because it's a very liberal state. And so I wonder what kind of hell he went through after laughing at me for being a security guard, right? And that's not to be like a ha ha or anything like that. I am super grateful that we have police. And even what's even more funny is in that situation, seeing that police officer regularly at the coffee shop when a lot of the controversy about the police and police killing started to arise in the media, because this was a coffee shop I went to for years. Like we're talking about 4 or 5 years I went to this place. So I seen this guy regularly. I didn't know him well ever, but when I started seeing the controversy about white police officers killing black victims, I remember going up to this particular police officer and communicating my appreciation for him, his coworkers, and what they did. And so it's just ironic that some years later, when I'm working a legal, normal job, that this same man would laugh at me. But like I said, he didn't know me, didn't know anything about me, didn't know my background as a veteran, et cetera, et cetera. And so I had to be more mature in that situation. And I think that's always going to be the case, because one of the biggest things that I learned growing up and getting picked on and being bullied so much for being overweight is there's always going to be someone who devalues you, belittles you, judges you without really knowing who you are, because that's just something that humans do. And so it's one thing to change careers because you genuinely have an interest in doing something else. It's also because you do need more money, because you want to create a better existence for your family. It's another thing to change careers because you're chasing the respect of other people, or chasing the validation. That's the word I'm looking for, the validation of other people. Because I don't think you're ever going to find it until I learn to validate myself. Doesn't matter how much job hopping I do, I'm always going to be unsatisfied. And so this is just something to think about, guys. Like, accept who you are. I love writing and content creation and thinking about fitness and self-improvement. And being a security guard allows me to do that. And when I'm in the right mind frame, I am super grateful for that. Doesn't mean I'll always do it, or it doesn't mean that I always want to do it. But if that happens to be, if I retire as security guard, then it's on me to validate myself and respect myself enough to be happy with who I am and to ignore someone's judgment of me because I don't have a certain income or a certain title. So something to think about, guys. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to the channel. If you're listening on Spotify, make sure to follow the podcast. Visit travisdaigle.com. Subscribe to the blog. Remember, every episode of the podcast is based on articles from the blog that I've already written, some of them 3-4 months ago. And so if you want to get the ideas ahead of time, be subscribed to the blog so you can read that on a regular basis. And make sure you go check out the book. The link is on my website, Adapt and Overcome, 3 Principles to Master the Most Important Skill in Life, Personal Ownership. I'll talk to y'all next time.